Good evening, my dear friend. Tonight, I wish to tell you about one of the most curious cases Sherlock Holmes and I ever encountered. Even now, many years later, when the fire burns low and the rain taps softly upon my window, I can still picture that strange summer of 1895. It was a year filled with unusual affairs, and yet one dark mystery remains clearer in my memory than many greater cases. At that time, Sherlock Holmes was in splendid health and spirits. His reputation had spread through every corner of England, and many famous people climbed the 17 steps to our rooms in Baker Street. Yet Holmes cared little for wealth or praise. A curious puzzle was worth more to him than a king's reward. During the first week of July, I noticed that my friend was often absent from our lodgings. He would leave before breakfast and return long after dark. Several rough-looking men called at our door, asking for a certain Captain Basil, and I quickly understood that Holmes was once again moving through London under one of his many disguises. I asked no questions, for I had long learned that Holmes revealed his secrets only when the proper moment arrived. Then one morning, the door of our sitting room opened, and in walked Sherlock Holmes, carrying a great harpoon beneath his arm. I stared at him in complete astonishment. Little did I know that this strange weapon would lead us into the shadow of a man known throughout Sussex as Black Peter. I still remember the curious sight of Holmes standing in our breakfast room with the long harpoon resting against his shoulder. The morning sunlight fell through the window, and the weapon seemed entirely out of place among our coffee cups and newspapers. Holmes laid it carefully beside his chair and helped himself to breakfast, as though nothing unusual had happened. There was a sparkle in his eyes that I knew very well. It appeared whenever some difficult problem had captured his imagination. I could not help wondering where he had found such an object, nor why he had been carrying it through the streets of London. For several days my friend had been wrapped in secrecy. He had vanished for hours at a time, and the name of Captain Basil had become strangely familiar to our landlady. Yet he had offered me no explanation. The mystery deepened when Holmes mentioned, in his calm and ordinary manner, that he had spent the early morning performing an experiment with harpoon. I confess that I felt both amused and puzzled. Whenever Holmes began conducting unusual experiments, I knew that some extraordinary case was close at hand. Outside our window, Baker Street was slowly waking. Carriage wheels rolled over the damp road, and the soft grey fog of London drifted between the buildings. Then came a knock upon the door. Holmes looked up at once. "I have been expecting our visitor," he said quietly. At that moment, I could not imagine where the matter would lead us, nor that before another day had passed, we would be traveling into the lonely woods of Sussex in search of a terrible secret. A few moments later, our visitor was shown into the room. He was a young inspector from Scotland Yard named Stanley Hopkins, a man for whom Holmes had great respect. I had met him before and liked him well enough. He possessed energy and intelligence, though he had not yet learned the endless patience that made Holmes such a remarkable detective. On this particular morning, however, there was little cheer in his face. He looked tired and troubled, as though sleep had not visited him. Holmes invited him to join us at breakfast, but the inspector gently declined. He had come, he said, to ask for help. That alone was enough to interest me greatly, for Hopkins was not a man who surrendered easily. Case had defeated him. The matter concerned the violent death of a retired sea captain named Peter Carey, who lived in a lonely place called Woodman's Lee in Sussex. The dead man was known to nearly everyone in the district by another name, Black Peter. Even the title seemed dark and unpleasant. As the inspector began to speak, the room grew very quiet. I could hear only the faint ticking of the clock upon the mantelpiece and the distant sound of a carriage passing through Baker Street. Holmes leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, a habit of his when listening closely. I had the curious feeling that he already knew far more about the affair than he was willing to admit. And so a morning light slowly filled our sitting room. Inspector Hopkins began telling us the strange story of the man called Black Peter and the terrible event that had taken place in his lonely cabin among the Sussex woods. Inspector Hopkins unfolded a few notes, began to describe the man whose death had caused such excitement. Peter Carey, told us, had once been a famous captain of sealing and whaling ships. He had spent many years in the northern seas and had earned a reputation for courage and great skill. Yet, despite his success, he was feared wherever he went. After retiring from the sea, he had bought a small property called Woodman's Lee and had lived there quietly for several years. Quietly, however, was perhaps the wrong word. According to everyone who knew him, Peter Carey possessed a violent and terrible temper. He was a large and powerful man, with dark features and a great black beard, and from these things, and perhaps from the darkness in his nature, he had gained the name of Black Peter. The inspector spoke gently, but the picture he painted was not a pleasant one. When drink overcame him, the captain became almost like another person. His wife and daughter lived in constant fear. The servants rarely remained in the house for long, and the neighbors avoided him whenever possible. There was little kindness in the memories people carried of him. Most curious of all was his habit of sleeping apart from the house. A short distance from the main building stood a small wooden cabin. It had only one room and looked more like the cabin of a ship than a country cottage. Black Peter kept the key always with him. No servant was permitted to enter. He made his own bed and cleaned the place himself. At night, a lamp often shone through its curtained window, and the villagers would wonder what strange thoughts occupied the old sea captain as he sat there alone. Even now, many years later, I can still imagine that lonely little cabin standing among the trees, and it was there, in that silent place, that a terrible and mysterious death awaited us. The inspector paused for a moment before continuing his account. 2 days before the murder, a local workman had been walking along the road late at night. As he passed the grounds of Woodman's Lee, he noticed that a light was still burning in the captain's cabin. That in itself was not unusual. But as he glanced toward the window, he believed he saw the shadow of a man upon the blind. The figure wore a beard, yet it did not resemble Peter Carey. The beard appeared shorter and different in shape. The witness was certain of what he had seen, though there remained some doubt, for he had spent part of the evening at a public house, and the cabin stood some distance from the road. Still, the story was curious. Then came the night before the tragedy. Black Peter had been drinking heavily and had fallen into one of his dark moods. He wandered through the house in anger, and even his family feared to go near him. At last he left the house and walked down the familiar path toward his lonely cabin. No one saw him again, alive. In the deep hours of the morning, his daughter, whose window stood open because of the summer warmth, heard a terrible cry coming from among the trees. Yet such cries were not uncommon. Her father had been drinking, and she thought little of it. When daylight came, one of the servants noticed that the cabin door stood open. Even then, no one dared approach it. The fear that Black Peter inspired remained strong, even after the strange cry in the night. It was nearly midday before anyone gathered enough courage to look inside, and when they did, they fled back toward the village with faces as white as paper. Something dreadful had happened in that lonely little cabin. The strangest part of the mystery was still to come. As Inspector Hopkins continued his account, I found myself leaning forward in my chair. There was something deeply unsettling about the lonely cabin and the terrible figure of Black Peter. The servant who had first looked through the open door had seen enough to send the whole household into panic. Within a short time, the village was buzzing with fearful whispers, and the police had been summoned. Hopkins himself had reached Woodman's Lee before long. Even now I can still remember the serious expression upon his face as he described what he had found. The little cabin had looked exactly like the room of an old sea captain. There was a narrow bunk in one corner, maps and charts upon the walls, and shelves filled with books and log records from long voyages. Everything spoke of distant oceans and dangerous northern seas. But in the middle of that small room stood a dreadful sight. Captain Peter Carey was dead. Great steel harpoon had passed through his chest and into the wooden wall behind him. It was as though some giant hand had pinned him there. The cry that his daughter had heard in the night had been his final moment. Though the scene was terrible, Hopkins explained it calmly, and Holmes listened without the slightest interruption. The strange thing, however, was that there appeared to be very little evidence. No clear footprints had been found. No signs of robbery could be discovered. Yet certain curious objects remained in the cabin. These, according to the inspector, might hold the secret of the crime. Holmes slowly folded his hands and looked toward the fire. I knew that expression well. His mind had already begun to move along paths that the rest of us could scarcely imagine. And somewhere among those small and curious details, the first true clue to the mystery of Black Peter was waiting to be found. Inspector Hopkins then told us about the curious objects that had been found inside the cabin. The weapon itself was the first mystery. The harpoon had not been brought there by the murderer. It belonged to Captain Carey and had been hanging upon the wall with two others. One place on the rack was empty, and that missing harpoon had become the instrument of death. This suggested that the deed had been done suddenly and with great force. Another detail interested Holmes at once. Upon the table stood a bottle of rum and two used glasses. It seemed that Black Peter had not been alone that night. He had been drinking with someone, yet other bottles of spirits remained untouched nearby. Why had only the rum been chosen? At the time I thought little of it, but I would later learn that Holmes never ignored even the smallest thing. There was also a tobacco pouch lying upon the table. It was made from the skin of a seal and contained a quantity of strong tobacco. Upon its flap were the letters P.C. At first glance, the initials belonged to Peter Carey himself. Even so, Holmes seemed thoughtful. I noticed the faint narrowing of his eyes, which often meant that some idea had begun to form in his mind. Then there was another object, perhaps stranger than all the rest. It was an old notebook, worn and stained by use. Upon its first page were written several initials and dates, together with lists of figures and strange markings. The inspector believed that the little book might be of great importance. As he placed it upon our breakfast table in Baker Street, Holmes picked it up with great care. I could see at once that his interest had deepened. Little did I know what Holmes had already begun to suspect. The little notebook passed slowly through Holmes's hands. I still remember the way he examined it. He turned it toward the light, studied its worn cover, and then opened its pages one by one. Inside were rows of figures and several curious headings. There were also the initials J.H.N., written upon the first page, together with a date from many years earlier. To me, the notes meant very little. To Holmes, however, every mark and every stain had meaning. The inspector explained that he believed the book might belong to the murderer. The figures appeared to concern valuable securities and investments. If so, perhaps money had been the reason for the terrible crime. It was certainly an interesting thought. Yet Holmes remained quiet. At last he pointed to a faint stain upon the cover. The notebook, it seemed, had been marked with blood. The inspector explained that it had been found upon the floor near the door of the cabin. If that were true, then the book had almost certainly been dropped after the murder had been committed. The room grew very still. Outside, I could hear the distant rumble of carriage wheels and the soft cries of street sellers beginning their morning business. Within our sitting room, however, all attention rested upon this curious notebook. No money had been taken from the cabin. Nothing seemed to have been stolen. And yet this strange little book hinted at secrets involving wealth, a lost property, and perhaps events that had happened many years before. Holmes placed the notebook gently upon the table and sat in thoughtful silence. Then he looked up. At last, he said, he must visit Woodman's Lee for himself. And so began our journey toward the lonely cabin where Black Peter had met his violent end. Within a quarter of an hour, we had left Baker Street behind us. A cab carried us through the busy London streets, while Inspector Hopkins sat opposite us, speaking now and then what the case that troubled him so deeply. Holmes, however, had fallen into one of his thoughtful silences. He leaned back in his seat, his long fingers pressed together and his eyes half closed. I knew better than to interrupt him. Whenever he became so quiet, his mind was working with extraordinary speed. At last we reached the railway station and began our journey south towards Sussex. I have always enjoyed traveling through the English countryside. The air seemed fresher there, and the gentle green fields offered a pleasant contrast to the smoke and noise of London. As our train rolled onward, I looked out of the window and reflected upon the strange affair before us. Who had shared a bottle of rum with Black Peter on that summer night? Who had possessed the strength to drive a heavy harpoon through such a powerful man? And what connection could there possibly be between a murdered sea captain and an old notebook filled with figures and mysterious initials? The questions seemed endless. Even now, many years later, I can still remember the curious feeling that came over me during that journey. It was as though invisible threads were drawing together, though none of us could yet see the pattern they formed. At length, we left the train and continued our journey by carriage through quiet country roads and the remains of ancient woodland. Somewhere among those lonely trees stood the little cabin of Black Peter, and before the day was over, Sherlock Holmes would place his own eyes upon the scene of the crime. The road wound gently through fields and patches of old woodland. Inspector Hopkins sat beside the driver, while Holmes and I rode together in a carriage behind. The morning was bright and pleasant, yet the story we had heard seems to cast a shadow over the countryside. At length, the carriage turned into a narrow lane and approached a lonely house of gray stone. A few trees stood nearby, and beyond them rose the dark line of the forest. "This is Woodman's Lee," said Hopkins. A short distance from the house stood a small wooden building, partly hidden by bushes. Even from afar, it looked lonely and mysterious. I knew at once that this was the cabin where Black Peter had spent his nights. We first entered the house itself. There we met the widow of the dead man, a tired-looking woman whose face seemed marked by many unhappy years. Fear still lingered in her eyes, even though her husband was gone. With her stood her daughter, a pale young lady who spoke of her father without affection or sorrow. Indeed, she seemed almost relieved that his terrible rule had come to an end. I confess that I felt deep pity for both women. It became plain to me that Captain Peter Carey brought little happiness to his household. After a few quiet questions, Holmes thanked them and led the way back into the sunlight. We followed a narrow path across the grass toward the little cabin among the trees. The air was still, and not a sound disturbed the peaceful morning. Yet I could not shake the feeling that the small wooden building before us still held many secrets, and Sherlock Holmes was about to begin searching for them. Inspector Hopkins stepped toward the cabin door and reached into his pocket for the key. Then he suddenly paused. A look of surprise crossed his face. Someone, he said, had been tampering with the lock. I bent forward and saw at once what he meant. The paint around the keyhole had been scratched, and the fresh marks upon the wood were plainly visible. Whoever had done it had tried to force an entry. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked slowly around the little building and examined one of the windows. Presently he called us to him. There were marks there also. Someone had attempted to open the window and had failed. I remember the curious expression came over Holmes's face. It was not alarm, nor even surprise. It was satisfaction. To my astonishment, he appeared pleased by this new development. The inspector was greatly puzzled and wondered whether some curious villager had wandered into the grounds during the night. Holmes gently shook his head. Such an explanation did not satisfy him. Whoever had come there had wanted something inside the cabin. More importantly, that person had expected to find the door open. When the attempt failed, there was every reason to think that another attempt would soon follow. As I listened, I felt a quiet thrill of anticipation. It seemed that the mystery, instead of growing colder, had suddenly become alive again. Holmes's eyes shone with interest. "Fortune," he said softly, "had been very kind to us. Little did I know that before another night had passed, we would be hiding among the bushes outside that lonely cabin, waiting in silence for an unexpected visitor." The door of the cabin was unlocked at last, and we stepped inside. I confess that I felt a slight unease as I crossed the threshold. Although the terrible traces of the crime had been removed, the room still seemed to hold the memory of that dreadful night. It was indeed more like the cabin of a ship than a room upon land. At one end stood a narrow bunk. There was a heavy sea chest beneath the window, and upon the walls hung maps, charts, and pictures for whaling ships. Shelves contained old logbooks and other records from Captain Carey's years at sea. Everything about the place spoke of distant oceans, storms, and lonely voyages among northern ice. For nearly 2 hours, Holmes examined every corner of that little room. He moved slowly and with extraordinary patience. Sometimes he would kneel to study the floor. At other times, he would stand perfectly still before a shelf or table, his keen eyes taking in every detail. Neither Hopkins nor I ventured to disturb him. At length, Holmes stopped before one of the shelves. Something there had caught his attention. A small patch was less dusty than the rest. It seemed that an object had once stood there and had recently been removed. Perhaps it had been a book, perhaps a box. No one could say. Yet Holmes appeared to consider the matter important. At last he straightened himself and gave a little sigh. For the moment, he said, there was nothing more to be learned inside the cabin. Then, to my surprise, he suggested that we spend the afternoon quietly among the woods and return later. I knew that familiar tone. Some plan had already formed in his mind. And the coming night, I felt certain, would bring with it a new and curious development. The afternoon passed quietly among the woods of Sussex. Holmes seemed perfectly content to wander beneath the trees, saying very little. He paused now and then to observe a flower, or to watch a bird moving through the branches. To anyone who did not know him, he might have appeared entirely fiefcure. I knew better. Whenever Holmes became calm and almost dreamy in this fashion, his mind was usually occupied with a difficult problem. For my own part, I found it impossible to forget the strange little cabin and the mystery that surrounded it. Someone had tried to force an entrance only the night before. Who was this unknown visitor? Why had he returned after the death of Black Peter? And what object inside the cabin could possibly be important enough to risk such a dangerous journey? As the afternoon faded into evening, we returned to meet Inspector Hopkins. The detective had remained close to the cabin, keeping watch and hoping for some further clue. Holmes then explained his plan. We would not wait inside the cabin itself. Instead, we would hide among the bushes near one of the windows. If the stranger returned and lit a candle, we should be able to observe everything without being seen. The arrangement seemed wise. Soon darkness began to settle over the countryside. A gentle rain started to fall, and the leaves above us whispered softly in the night breeze. The lonely cabin stood silent among the trees. Its dark windows looked almost black against the faint light of the sky. At last we took our places among the bushes and settled ourselves to wait. Little did I know what sort of visitor would soon emerge from the darkness and step quietly toward the door of Black Peter's cabin. It was a long and quiet vigil. The three of us crouched among the bushes beside the cabin, speaking not a single word. The gentle rain continued to fall, and now and then a drop of water slipped from the leaves above and touched my face. Far away, I could hear the faint sounds of the village settling into sleep. One by one, those small noises faded until a deep stillness lay over the countryside. I have often thought that there is something strangely peaceful about such moments of waiting. Even though danger may be near, the silence itself seems to slow the world. The little cabin stood before us like a dark shape among the trees. Its door and windows showed no sign of life. Time passed very slowly. A church clock somewhere in the distance marked the hours with soft chimes. Midnight came, went. Then 1 o'clock. Still we waited. Inspector Hopkins shifted his position from time to time, but Holmes remained perfectly motionless. I could scarcely tell that he was beside me. At last, the clock struck 2:30. The night had reached its darkest hour. Then, suddenly, a faint sound broke the silence. It came from the direction of the gate. A soft click. Every muscle in my body became tense. For several moments nothing more happened. Then I heard it. Cautious footstep. Someone was moving slowly toward the cabin. Even now, many years later, I can still remember the curious feeling that passed through me at that moment. The unknown visitor had returned at last, and the strangest part of the adventure was only beginning. The footsteps came closer. Then there was silence once more. I could hear only the gentle rain falling upon the leaves and the steady beating of my own heart. A moment later, a faint scraping sound reached our ears. Someone was trying to open the door. The stranger worked cautiously, and I could picture him standing there in the darkness, bent over the lock. There came the soft clink of metal against metal. Then, quite suddenly, a sharp snap. The door had opened. A match flared inside the cabin. For an instant, a warm glow shone through the curtain, and then the steady light of a candle filled the little room. All three of us fixed our eyes upon the window. The visitor was not at all what I had expected. Instead of a rough and dangerous-looking man, he appeared to be a young gentleman perhaps no more than 20 years of age. He was thin and pale, with a dark mustache and an expression of deep anxiety. Indeed, I have rarely seen a person so frightened. Even through the window I could see that his hands trembled. He looked around the cabin with wide and uneasy eyes, as though he feared that some dreadful thing might rise before him. At last he moved toward one of the shelves and took down a large book. Standing beside the table, he quickly turned its pages. Then his face changed. He closed the book with a sudden movement of disappointment and anger. A moment later he blew out the candle and turned toward the door. But he was not to leave so easily, for Inspector Hopkins had already risen silently from his hiding place. The time had come to discover who this mysterious visitor really was. The young man had scarcely reached the doorway when Inspector Hopkins sprang forward from the darkness and seized him firmly by the arm. A low cry escaped the stranger. The candle was lit once more, and its warm glow filled the little cabin. There stood our prisoner, pale and trembling, his eyes moving anxiously from one face to another. I confess that I felt more pity than suspicion. There was something about the young man's appearance that seemed entirely at odds with the terrible murder of Black Peter. He looked less like a criminal than a frightened student who had wandered into some unhappy situation. Hopkins, however, remained calm and determined. He asked the stranger who he was and why he had entered the cabin at such an hour. For a few moments, the young man seemed unable to answer. Then, gathering his courage, he spoke quietly. He declared that he had nothing to do with Captain Carey's death, and begged us to believe him. The sincerity in his voice made me glance toward Holmes. My friend was watching the prisoner with great attention. There was no triumph in his face, nor even surprise. Instead, he seemed deeply interested, as though this unexpected visitor had brought with him an entirely new piece of the puzzle. At last, the young man gave his name. He was called John Hupley Nelligan. I noticed at once that both Holmes and Inspector Hopkins exchanged a quick glance. The name meant something to them, though at that moment it meant very little to me. And as the rain whispered softly outside the cabin, the frightened young man prepared to tell us a story that reached far back into the past and far beyond the lonely woods of Sussex. The young man sank down upon a wooden chest, and for a few moments he seemed unable to collect his thoughts. The candlelight fell upon his pale face, and I could see that he was greatly distressed. At last he lifted his head. There was a quiet dignity in his manner now, as though he had decided that concealment would serve no purpose. He asked if he might speak freely. Inspector Hopkins agreed, and so, in the lonely cabin of the dead sea captain, we listened to a most unexpected tale. The name of John Hupley Nelligan, he explained, had once been known throughout the west of England. Many years before, his father had been a banker of considerable reputation. Then disaster had come. The bank had failed, fortunes had been lost, and terrible accusations had fallen upon the elder Mr. Nelligan. It was widely believed that he had fled with a large amount of valuable property belonging to others. The scandal had ruined the family. Even after all those years, the son still carried the weight of that unhappy story. As he spoke, his voice remained calm, but I could sense the sorrow that lay beneath his words. The rain outside had almost ceased, and the cabin seemed strangely peaceful. I remember glancing at Holmes. He stood with folded arms and listened without interruption, his keen eyes fixed upon the young man. It was plain that every word interested him deeply. At that moment, I could not imagine what connection could exist between an old banking scandal and the violent death of Black Peter. Yet I knew my friend well enough to understand that some hidden thread is slowly being revealed, and the story of John Hoplin Nelligan had only just begun. John Hopley Nelligan then told us a story that reached back to his childhood. He'd been only a boy when his father's banking business collapsed. The newspapers had spoken harshly of the matter, and many people believed that the elder Mr. Nelligan had taken the money of others and fled. But the son did not believe it, nor did his mother. According to the young man, his father had left home with the firm intention of saving his reputation. He had taken with him a number of valuable securities and had hoped to turn them into money so that every debt could be paid. Before he departed, he had promised that he would one day return with his honor restored, but he never came back. The small yacht in which he had sailed vanished without a trace. For many years, both mother and son believed that he had perished at sea. Then, quite unexpectedly, a strange discovery was made. Some of the very securities that had disappeared with Mr. Nelligan began to appear in London. The young man's faithful friend, who had never abandoned the family, brought him this astonishing news. If those papers have returned to England, then perhaps his father had not carried them to the bottom of the sea. Perhaps someone else had possessed them. And so John Hopley Nelligan devoted himself to tracing their path. The search took many months and demanded great patience. At last it led him to one name, Captain Peter Carey. As the young man spoke those words, I felt the mystery deepen once again. What connection could possibly exist between a vanished banker and the fierce old seaman known as Black Peter? Even Holmes's eyes seemed to brighten slightly. The answer, I felt certain, lay hidden somewhere in the captain's lonely cabin, and in the forgotten events of many years before. John Hopley Nelligan continued his story in a quiet and earnest voice. When he learned that Captain Peter Carey had once possessed the missing securities, he became determined to discover how they had come into the seaman's hands. His search led him to another curious fact. In the year when his father disappeared, Peter Carey had been captain of a whaling ship called the Sea Unicorn. The vessel had been returning from the northern seas at almost the very time that Mr. Nelligan's little yacht had vanished. The coincidence was too remarkable to ignore. The young man began to wonder whether his father's small craft, driven by storms and rough weather, might somehow have crossed paths with the Sea Unicorn. If that had happened, then perhaps Captain Carey knew the truth. Perhaps he knew what had become of the missing banker. Perhaps he knew why the securities had later appeared in England. These questions gave the young man no peace. At last, he traveled to Sussex, intending to speak directly with Peter Carey, but fate had been cruel. Almost at the very moment of his arrival, the old sea captain had been murdered. Thus the one man who might have answered his questions had been silenced forever. Even then, however, John Hopley Nelligan had not abandoned hope. At the inquest, he learned that Captain Carey kept the old logbooks of the Sea Unicorn in his cabin. If he could read the entries from that distant year, perhaps they would reveal what had happened in the northern seas. That, he explained, was the reason for his secret visit. He had come, not as a murderer, but as a son searching for the truth about his lost father. As I listened, I could not help feeling sympathy for him. Yet the mystery of Black Peter seemed no nearer to a solution. Indeed, it had become stranger than ever. The young man explained that he had first attempted to enter the cabin on the previous night, but had been unable to open the door. This second attempt finally succeeded. Once inside, he had gone directly to the shelf where the old log books were kept. There he found the volume he needed, and eagerly turned its pages, searching for the entries made during the month of August, in the year of his father's disappearance. But fortune had once again disappointed him. The pages he sought were missing. Someone had torn them from the book. The very record that might have explained the fate of his father had vanished. It was at that moment, he said, that Inspector Hopkins had seized him. His story now seemed complete. The little cabin grew quiet once more. The candle flickered gently, and beyond the window the rain had almost ceased. Then the inspector asked whether there was anything further that he wished to tell us. For the first time, the young man hesitated. A shadow seemed to pass across his face. He finally answered that there was nothing more, but I noticed that Holmes continued to watch him with great attention. It was one of those moments when my friend appeared to look beyond the spoken words and into the thoughts of the speaker himself. I had the curious feeling that the matter was not entirely finished. And indeed, before another minute had passed, Inspector Hopkins reached into his pocket and produced an object that caused our prisoner to grow pale with alarm. The mystery of Black Peter was about to take yet another unexpected turn. From his pocket, Inspector Hopkins drew out the small notebook that had been found upon the floor of the cabin. The moment John Hopley Nelligan saw it, all color seemed to leave his face. For an instant he stared at it in complete astonishment. Then he buried his face in his hands. The notebook, it appeared, belonged to him. His initials were written inside, and there could be no doubt that he had once carried it. The discovery seemed most unfortunate. To the inspector, it appeared to be powerful evidence against the young man. How could his notebook have come to lie beside the dead body if he had never entered the cabin before? The question was difficult to answer. With great distress, the prisoner explained that he had believed he had lost the little book at his hotel. He had no idea how it had reached the cabin. The explanation sounded weak even to my ears. Inspector Hopkins looked more satisfied than ever. I could see that he believed the case to be solved. To him, the matter now seemed perfectly simple. A young man with a hidden purpose had come to the cabin, and his own notebook been discovered beside the murdered captain. What stronger proof could there be? Yet, I noticed something curious. Sherlock Holmes did not appear convinced. He stood quietly, his expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. Indeed, there was even a trace of disappointment upon his face. I had long known that, when Holmes remained doubtful, there was usually good reason. At that moment, I felt that the mystery of Black Peter still contained some hidden truth that had not yet been brought into the light. The strangest part of the adventure, I suspected, was still to come. A short time later, Inspector Hopkins announced that he must take the young man to the police station. John Hopley Nelligan offered no resistance. Indeed, he seemed almost exhausted by the long strain of the evening. His shoulders drooped, and there was a look of sadness in his eyes that stirred my sympathy. As we walked back toward the village, the first pale signs of dawn were beginning to touch the eastern sky. The rain had ceased, and the air felt cool and fresh after our long vigil. Inspector Hopkins, however, was in excellent spirits. He believed that he had solved the mystery at last. The notebook, the secret visits to the cabin, and the strange story about the missing securities all appeared to point in one direction. For his part, Holmes said very little. He walked beside me in silence, his hands in the pockets of his coat, and his head slightly bowed. I had known him too long to mistake that silence. Whenever Holmes became unusually quiet after an apparent success, it often meant that his mind remained unsatisfied. At length, I ventured to ask whether he believed the case to be finished. He gave a faint smile. There was, he said, something about the explanation that did not fit comfortably with the facts. Those words surprised me greatly. To my mind, the evidence against the young man seemed considerable, Yet Holmes spoke with such calm certainty that I could not dismiss his doubts. As the first birds began to sing among the trees, I had the curious feeling that our adventure was far from over. Little did I know that Sherlock Holmes had already begun to follow an entirely different path toward the truth. The following morning we returned to London. The train rolled steadily through the countryside, and the soft light of early day shone across the fields. Yet my thoughts remained fixed upon the events of the night before. At last I turned to Holmes and asked him directly whether he believed that young Nelligan was guilty. My friend looked out of the window for a few moments before answering. Then he slowly shook his head. "No," he said. He was far from satisfied. The explanation offered by Inspector Hopkins seemed neat and simple, but it failed to account for several important facts. I listened with great interest. First, there was the manner of the murder itself. The heavy harpoon had been driven with such tremendous force that it had passed through Captain Carey's body and deep into the wooden wall behind him. Such a blow required not only strength, but also great skill. Could the pale and slender young man we had captured possibly have performed such a feat? Holmes did not believe it. Then there was another question. Was young Nelligan the sort of person who would sit drinking rum in the middle of the night with a rough old sailor at Black Peter? Again the idea seemed difficult to accept. And what of the bearded figure that had been seen at the cabin window 2 nights before the crime? Could that mysterious visitor have been the frightened young gentleman we had met? Holmes thought not. As he spoke, I began to understand his doubts. The case, which had appeared so simple only a few hours earlier, was once again becoming deeply mysterious. At length, Holmes fell silent and gazed thoughtfully from the carriage window. Little did I know that they had already formed a new theory, one that would soon lead us toward the true solution of the adventure of Black Peter. By the time we reached Baker Street, the afternoon light was beginning to fade. Hudson had placed a cheerful fire in the grate, and the familiar comfort of our sitting room seemed a pleasant contrast to the lonely woods of Sussex. Holmes, however, remained deeply occupied. He sat in his armchair, his long fingers pressed together and his eyes half closed. I had learned from experience that such moments should not be disturbed. For nearly an hour he neither spoke nor moved. Then, quite suddenly, he rose, crossed to the table, and began opening the letters that had arrived during our absence. I watched him with mild curiosity. Most of the letters were quickly set aside, but one of them produced an entirely different effect. No sooner had Holmes read its contents than his face brightened. He gave a soft laugh of satisfaction and tapped the paper against his hand. The change in him was remarkable. The weariness that had followed our long night in Sussex seemed to disappear at once. At last, he said, the alternative was beginning to develop. I confess that I understood nothing of his meaning. He then asked me for several telegraph forms. Without delay, he dictated 2 brief messages. One was addressed to a shipping agent in the East End of London. The other was sent to Inspector Stanley Hopkins, inviting him to breakfast with us on the following morning. There was a note of quiet confidence in Holmes' voice that greatly interested me. Some new idea had clearly entered his mind, yet he offered no explanation. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and declared that the troublesome case had occupied his thoughts for 10 long days, and that tomorrow, he hoped, would bring its final answer. Little did I know that Sherlock Holmes had already laid a trap for the true murderer of Black Peter. The next morning dawned bright and clear over Baker Street. At precisely 9:30, Inspector Stanley Hopkins arrived at our rooms. He appeared cheerful and confident, for he believed that his difficult case had already been solved. Hudson soon placed breakfast before us, and for a little while the conversation remained pleasant and ordinary. Then Holmes quietly returned to the subject of Black Peter. He asked the inspector whether he still believed that young John Hopkins was the murderer. Hopkins replied without hesitation that he did. To him, the evidence seemed complete. The young man had been near the cabin. His notebook had been found beside the dead captain, and his own story had placed him at the center of the mystery. Holmes listened patiently. At last he began to point out the difficulties in this explanation. The great strength needed to drive the harpoon through Captain Carey was the first. Then there was the matter of the rum and the rough habits of seamen, and finally there remained the mysterious bearded figure that had been seen at the cabin window before the murder. One by one, these questions weakened the inspector's confidence. I could see the change in his face. His earlier certainty slowly gave way to doubt. Yet, if young Nelligan was innocent, then who had killed Black Peter? Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he smiled quietly and glanced toward the door. I remember that moment very clearly. There was something almost playful in his expression. Then he spoke words that filled us both with surprise. He said that the man we sought was very near at hand. Indeed, he believed that the true murderer of Black Peter was already upon the stairs and would enter our rooms within a few moments. Even before Holmes had finished speaking, we heard voices upon the stairs. A moment later, there came a knock at the door. Mr. Hudson entered and announced that 3 men had arrived and wished to see Captain Bassel. The name meant nothing to Inspector Hopkins, but I knew at once that Holmes had once again been conducting some private investigation under one of his many disguises. To my surprise, he asked that the men be shown in one at a time. The first visitor was a small, cheerful-looking seaman with red cheeks and white whiskers. Holmes questioned him briefly, and then, after thanking him for coming, sent him into another room. The second man was tall and thin, with a weather-beaten face that spoke of many years at sea. He, too, was politely dismissed. By now, Inspector Hopkins looked completely puzzled. As for myself, I could make little sense of these proceedings. Then the third man entered. I shall never forget my first sight of him. He was a powerful fellow, broad in the shoulders and strongly built. A thick beard framed a face that reminded me of a great sea dog, and beneath heavy eyebrows his dark eyes shone with remarkable boldness. There was strength in every movement he made. He stood before us calmly, turning his cap in his hands. Holmes questioned him in friendly manner about his trade. The man replied that he was a harpooner and had spent many years upon whaling ships. At those words, I saw a curious light appear in Holmes's eyes. The game, I felt certain, had entered its final stage. Little did I know that within the next few minutes, the mystery of Black Peter would be solved in a most dramatic fashion. Holmes continued his questions in an easy and friendly manner. The seaman's name, we learned, was Patrick Cairns. He had made many voyages to the northern seas and was seeking employment once again. Everything about him suggested great strength and experience. Holmes seemed entirely satisfied. He told the man that he was exactly the sort of person he required, and pointed toward a paper lying upon the side table. It was an agreement for employment, and all that remained was for the sailor to sign it. Patrick Cairns crossed the room without suspicion. He bent over the table and took up the pen. I remember that the morning sunlight was falling across the paper, and for one peaceful moment there seemed nothing unusual in the scene before us. Then everything happened with astonishing speed. Holmes stepped quietly behind the sailor and suddenly threw both arms around his neck. At the same instant, there came the sharp click of steel. The great seaman gave a roar like an angry animal. Before I could fully understand what had happened, the two men were struggling fiercely upon the floor. Patrick Cairns possessed tremendous strength. Even with handcuffs upon his wrists, he fought with such energy that Holmes might have been overpowered had Inspector Hopkins and I not rushed to his assistance. At last, the man understood that resistance was useless. We secured him, and he sat breathing heavily while we recovered from the struggle. Inspector Hopkins stared in complete amazement. The true murderer of Black Peter, it seemed, had been sitting among us all along. And now, at last, Sherlock Holmes was ready to reveal how he had discovered the truth. For several moments no one spoke. The room was filled only by the heavy breathing of the captured sailor. Inspector Hopkins looked from the prisoner to Holmes, and then back again, as though he could scarcely believe what had happened. At last he found his voice. He admitted quite frankly that he did not understand any part of the matter. How had Holmes discovered this man, and what possible connection could a harpooner have with the death of Black Peter? Sherlock Holmes smiled kindly at the young detective. He never took pleasure in another person's mistakes, especially when that person was eager to learn. The lesson, he said, was a simple one. A detective should never become so attached to one explanation that he forgets to consider another. Hopkins had fixed all his attention upon young Nelligan, and had therefore overlooked a far more likely suspect. The clues, according to Holmes, had pointed in only one direction. The tremendous strength needed to use the harpoon, the bottle of rum, the rough tobacco in the sealskin pouch, and the habits of life suggested not a banker or a gentleman, but a sailor. More than that, they suggested a sailor who had once served aboard the Sea Unicorn. As I listened, the whole matter slowly began to grow clearer in my mind. Holmes had followed a path entirely different from that of the police, and by doing so, he had brought the true killer directly into our sitting room. The great seaman raised his head and looked steadily at us. Then, in a deep and weary voice, he spoke. He declared that he had indeed killed Peter Carey, but he denied that he was a murderer. And with those remarkable words, he began his own extraordinary story. Patrick Cairns sat quietly for a few moments before beginning his tale. The fierce look had gone from his face, and there was instead a certain sadness in his expression. He admitted freely that he had killed Black Peter, yet he insisted that there was a great difference between killing a man and murdering him. Then, in his deep seaman's voice, he told us of events that had taken place many years earlier. In the summer of 1883, he had served as a harpooner aboard the Sea Unicorn, commanded by Captain Peter Carey. The ship had been returning from the northern seas when they encountered a small yacht that had been driven far from its course by stormy weather. Only one man remained aboard the little vessel. The rest of the crew had apparently left in a small boat and had vanished. The stranger was taken aboard the Sea Unicorn. He carried with him only a small metal box. For a time the man remained in Captain Carey's cabin, and the two spoke together on several occasions. Then, quite suddenly, the stranger disappeared. The crew were told that he had either fallen overboard or thrown himself into the sea during the rough weather. No questions were asked, but Patrick Cairns knew the truth. On a dark night, while keeping watch, he had seen Captain Carey carry the unfortunate man to the side of the ship and cast him into the sea. The memory of that terrible sight had remained with him ever since. As he spoke, a deep silence settled over our sitting room. I felt a chill, despite the warmth of the fire. At last it seemed The mystery of John Hopley Nelligan's missing father was beginning to unfold. Patrick Cairns continued his story in a calm and steady voice. For many years he had kept his terrible knowledge to himself. The stranger who had vanished from the Sea Unicorn was none other than the missing banker, Mr. Nelligan. The small metal box he carried had contained the valuable securities that everyone believed had disappeared with him. Cairns suspected that Captain Carey had killed the unfortunate man for the sake of that box, yet he said nothing. Time passed, and the matter faded into memory. Then, many years later, he learned that Peter Carey had retired from the sea and was living quietly in Sussex. At once a plan formed in his mind. If the captain had indeed gained wealth through that dreadful deed, then perhaps he would pay generously to keep his secret hidden, and so Patrick Cairns traveled to Sussex. On his first visit, Black Peter had been reasonable enough. The two old seamen had spoken together, and an arrangement seemed possible. They agreed to meet again. But when Cairns returned a second time, he found the captain in a very different mood. Peter Carey had been drinking heavily. They sat together and shared rum while speaking of old days at sea. Yet, as the evening passed, Cairns became uneasy. There was something dangerous in the old captain's manner. He noticed one of the harpoons hanging nearby, and quietly kept it in mind. At last, the captain's temper broke. His face darkened with anger, and he reached for a large knife. In that terrible moment, Patrick Cairns believed that it was his own life or the captain's. And so, with all the strength of a practiced harpooner, he seized the weapon and struck. The great sailor lowered his head for a moment before continuing. When he seized the harpoon, he had no time for thought. Years of hard work upon the northern seas had made the weapon almost an extension of his own arm. The blow was swift and powerful. Captain Peter Carey gave a terrible cry and fell back against the wall. The harpoon passed through him and sank deep into the wood behind. The deed was done in an instant. Patrick Cairns told us that the sight had remained with him ever since. The old captain's final cry and the expression upon his face had often returned to him in the quiet hours of the night. For a time he simply stood there, hardly able to believe what had happened. Then he realized that all was silent. No one had come. No one had heard. As he looked around the cabin, his eyes fell upon the small metal box that stood upon a shelf. He believed that it contained the fortune for which Peter Carey had committed murder so many years before. Since the dead captain could no longer claim it, Cairns decided to take the box with him. As he prepared to leave, however, he made one careless mistake. In his haste, he left behind his tobacco pouch upon the table. That small object, which seemed so unimportant at the time, would later become one of the clues that guided Sherlock Holmes toward the truth. Then came the strangest part of all. As Cairns stepped out into the darkness, he heard someone approaching the cabin. At once he hid among the bushes and waited, and what he saw next surprised him as much as it surprised the rest of us. Hidden among the bushes, Patrick Cairns watched another figure approach the cabin. The newcomer moved quietly and cautiously, as though he feared being seen. He entered the little room and remained inside only a short while. Then, quite suddenly, there came a cry of alarm. A moment later, the man rushed out again and disappeared into the darkness as quickly as he had come. Patrick Cairns never learned who the stranger was, nor why he had visited the cabin that night. Only later did he discover that this frightened visitor had been young John Hopley Nelligan, searching for answers about his missing father. As for Cairns, He wasted no time in leaving the place. He walked many miles before reaching a railway station, and then made his way back to London. At last he opened the metal box that he had carried away with such high hopes. To his great disappointment, it contained no money. There were only papers and securities, things that he dared not sell and could not use. The treasure he had expected, Smolpolid, did not exist. He had gained nothing from his terrible adventure. Without work and almost without money, he found himself once again in the East End of London. Then he saw a notice seeking experienced harpooners for a northern voyage and offering excellent wages. He applied at once. And so, by one of those strange turns of fate that sometimes occur in life, he walked directly into the trap that Sherlock Holmes had prepared for him. The sailor's story had ended. A deep silence settled over our sitting room. The mystery of Black Peter had at last been laid bare. The one final question still remained in my mind. How had Holmes uncovered the truth so completely? Inspector Hopkins sat in complete amazement. I must confess that I felt something of the same emotion myself. The mystery that had seemed so dark and confusing now appeared wonderfully clear. Yet one question remained. How had Sherlock Holmes managed to discover the truth while everyone else had been following an entirely different path? Holmes settled comfortably in his chair and filled his pipe before answering. The case, he explained, had really begun with a few very simple observations. The manner of the murder had first attracted his attention. The harpoon had been driven with tremendous force. Such a deed could not easily have been accomplished by an ordinary man. It suggested someone of great strength and long experience with that particular weapon. Then there was the matter of the tobacco pouch. It had been made from sealskin and contained strong seaman's tobacco. Its presence pointed once again toward a sailor. There was also the bottle of rum. Many men might choose whiskey or brandy if both were available, but an old seaman often preferred rum above all other spirits. One clue after another seemed to lead in the same direction. At last Holmes became convinced that the murderer must have been someone connected with Captain Carey's life at sea, and if that were true, there was only one ship that truly mattered: the Sea Unicorn. Holmes therefore spent several days making inquiries and obtaining the names of the crew who had served aboard that vessel in the year 1883. Among them he found the name of Patrick Cairns, a harpooner. From that moment onward, the end of the mystery was already in sight. Little did I know that Holmes's explanation still contained one final and remarkable piece. Holmes continued his explanation while the morning sunlight slowly brightened our sitting room. Once he had identified Patrick Cairns as the most likely suspect, the rest of the matter became much simpler. He reasoned that the sailor was probably still in London. After all, a man who had suddenly found himself in possession of useless papers instead of money would need employment. It was also likely that he would wish to leave England for a time. So Holmes devised one of his clever little plans. Using the name of Captain Basil, he arranged for notices to be placed among the shipping agents of the East End. The advertisements offered excellent wages to experienced harpooners willing to join an Arctic expedition. It was, as Holmes admitted, with a smile, a bait that few seamen could resist. Then all he had to do was wait. In due course, 3 men answered the advertisement. Among them stood Patrick Cairns. The moment Holmes saw the great fellow with his powerful frame and weather-beaten face, his suspicions became certainty. Everything fitted. Here was a man strong enough to use a harpoon with deadly skill. Here was a sailor from the northern seas, And here was a man who had once sailed aboard the Sea Unicorn under Captain Peter Carey. The rest, as Holmes gently remarked, was only a matter of inviting the man to sign an agreement and placing handcuffs upon his wrists at the proper moment. Inspector Hopkins listened with admiration. Indeed, I believe that morning taught him one of the greatest lessons of his career. The smallest clue, if correctly understood, may lead to the truth. And in the case of Black Peter, the truth had finally emerged from many years of darkness. When at last the prisoner had been taken away, a peaceful silence settled once more over our rooms in Baker Street. The morning had advanced, and the cheerful fire still burned in the grate. Outside our windows, I could hear the distant rumble of carriages and the ordinary sounds of London beginning another day. For my own part, I sat for some time reflecting upon the strange chain of events that had brought the case to its conclusion. A violent sea captain, a vanished banker, a frightened young son searching for the truth, and a hardened sailor carrying a secret for many years, each had played a part in the mystery. It seemed remarkable that so many lives should become linked by one dark event upon the northern sea. Holmes, however, appeared entirely at ease. He leaned back in his chair and slowly filled his pipe with tobacco, as though the capture of a murderer were merely another morning's work. I have often admired that quality in my friend. Once problem had been solved, he laid it aside without regret and turned his thoughts toward the next challenge. Yet I could not forget young John Hopley. The poor fellow had carried the burden of his father's disgrace since childhood, and now, at last, the truth had begun to emerge. The unfortunate banker had not vanished by his own choice. He had been the victim of a terrible crime committed many years before. I remember saying that I hoped the young man would soon be released. Holmes nodded gently. Indeed, he said, an apology was owed to him, and with those words, the final threads of the curious adventure of Black Peter slowly began to draw together. Inspector Hopkins remained with us for a little while longer. I could see that he was still thinking over everything that had happened. The young detective possessed a sincere desire to improve himself, and although the morning had been a humbling one, he accepted the lesson with good grace. Holmes spoke kindly to him. A detective, he said, must always keep an open mind. One explanation may appear perfect, yet another possibility may lie hidden behind it. I have often remembered those words. Indeed, they seemed to describe Holmes' entire method. He never allowed himself to become the prisoner of his first idea. At length, Hopkins rose to take his leave. There was much to be done. Patrick Cairns had to be conveyed to a place of safety, and young John Hopley Nelligan had to be released from suspicion. The inspector thanked Holmes warmly for his assistance. I believe he left Baker Street with even greater admiration for my friend than before. When the door had closed behind him, the room became very quiet. Holmes stood by a window for a few moments, looking out at the passing traffic below. Then he turned back toward the fire. There remained one sad aspect of the affair. The missing security that had belonged to Mr. Nelligan would never be fully recovered. Some had already been sold, and much of the lost fortune had disappeared forever. Yet, despite this, something valuable had been restored. A father's honor, long buried beneath suspicion and shame, had finally been brought back into the light. And that, I thought, was perhaps the most satisfying ending that the strange adventure of Black Peter could have offered. For some time after Inspector Hopkins departed, I remained seated beside the fire, thinking over the extraordinary events we had witnessed. The case of Black Peter had begun as a brutal and puzzling murder, yet it had ended by uncovering a much older tragedy. I could not help feeling sympathy for nearly everyone involved. Young Sean Hopley Nelligan spent years carrying the weight of a disgrace that did not truly belong to his father. Patrick Cairns had allowed a dark secret to remain hidden for many years, and had finally been drawn into violence through fear and greed. And Peter Carey himself had lived under the shadow of a terrible deed committed long ago upon the lonely northern seas. There was something deeply sad about it all. Holmes, however, seemed content simply to have brought the truth into the open. He sat quietly in his chair, the blue smoke from his pipe rising lazily toward the ceiling. Outside, the morning had become bright and pleasant. A ray of sunshine touched the curtains, and from the street below came the familiar sounds of London life. The contrast between the peaceful scene and the dark story we had just heard struck me very strongly. I remarked that the affair had been one of the most curious cases we had encountered. Holmes smiled gently. He agreed that it possessed several unusual features, though to him it had become, in the end, a matter of following one clue patiently to its natural conclusion. That was always his gift. Where others saw confusion, he found order. Where others saw mystery, he discovered truth. And as I sat beside him that morning, I knew that the adventure of Black Peter would remain in my memory for many years to come. As the day wore on, I found myself returning again and again to one particular thought. How strange it is that a single event, hidden for years beneath the waves and forgotten by nearly everyone, should suddenly rise again and touch so many lives. Had the little yacht never crossed the path of the sea unicorn, the name of John Hopley Nelligan might never have been burdened by scandal. Had Peter Carey chosen honesty over greed, he might have passed his final years in peace instead of fear. And had Patrick Cairns spoken of what he had seen long ago, perhaps the entire tragedy might have been avoided. Such reflections often came to me after one of Holmes's cases. The mysteries themselves were fascinating, but it was the human side of them that remained longest in my memory. Holmes, I think, understood this as well, though he rarely spoke of it. As the afternoon light faded and the shadows lengthened across our sitting room, my friend finally rose from his chair. The case, so far as he was concerned, was finished. The truth had been discovered. The innocent had been cleared. The guilty man had confessed. There was nothing more to be done. Yet for me, the image of that lonely cabin among the Sussex trees remained very clear. I could still picture the silent room, the shelves of old log books, and the dark secrets that had slept there for so many years. Even now, many years later, I can still see it all as plainly as if it had happened only yesterday. And I knew that the adventure of Black Peter would always hold a special place among my recollections for Sherlock Holmes. As evening settled over Baker Street, I took up my notebook and made a few final observations concerning this singular adventure. There have been many cases in which I have seen Sherlock Holmes display his remarkable powers, yet the affair of Black Peter has always remained one of the most memorable. Perhaps it was because the mystery stretched backward across so many years. A dark deed committed upon a lonely sea returned at last to demand its answer. The truth had waited patiently, hidden among old log books, forgotten securities, and the troubled memories of men. Then, through one curious chain of events, everything had been brought to light. I have often thought of young John Hopley Nelligan. For him, the outcome meant more than the solving of a mystery. It meant that his father's name would no longer remain clouded by suspicion. Though the years that had been lost could never be returned, honor itself had at last been restored. I've also wondered about Patrick Cairns. He was a rough man of the sea, but I could not entirely regard him as a villain. In his own way, he had been both witness and victim of a tragedy that began long before he ever raised the fatal harpoon. As for Peter Carey, known everywhere as Black Peter, he had escaped justice for many years, yet in the end, the consequences of his actions found him. So often in our adventures, I learned that secrets, however deeply buried, have a curious way of rising again. And among all the lessons that Sherlock Holmes taught me, that may be one of the most enduring. And so, my dear friend, curious adventure of Black Peter came quietly to its end. Many years have passed since those events in Sussex, yet I can still picture the little wooden cabin standing among the trees, with its dark windows and its memories of distant seas. I can still see Sherlock Holmes seated by our fire in Baker Street, calmly drawing together the scattered threads of the mystery, while the rest of us wandered in confusion. That was his great gift. He possessed the rare ability to look beyond the obvious and to notice the small details that others ignored. A tobacco pouch, a bottle of rum, the strength required to cast a harpoon, each seemed insignificant alone, yet together they formed the path to truth. I learned many lessons during my years beside Sherlock Holmes, and this case reminded me of one of the greatest. We should never accept the first explanation, simply because it appears convenient. Truth often lies hidden in unexpected places. I was also reminded that the deeds of the past do not easily disappear. Long-buried secrets have a strange habit of returning, and sooner or later they ask to be remembered. Flung John Hupley Nelligan, the mystery brought peace at last. The shadow that had rested upon his father's name was lifted, and an old injustice was finally set right. As for Holmes and me, another remarkable chapter in our shared adventures had reached its close. The fire burned softly in Baker Street, the evening fog drifted beyond the windows, and London carried on with its endless life, scarcely aware that yet another strange mystery had been solved. And so, my dear friend, another curious adventure came quietly to its end. I hope you have enjoyed this recollection from old Baker Street. Until we meet again, good night.